Well, we have with us today Dr. Michael Gordon, who is a professor of history at Princeton University. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So to start, I was just wondering if you could tell me a little bit about yourself and your interest in fringe science and in pseudoscience, how that came to be.
So I'm a historian of science, and I started out specializing on fairly conventional stuff. Well, quasi-conventional. History of Russian science and Soviet science, which is slightly off the beaten path.
Mm-hmm.
And in that area, one often comes to the question of whether science in Russia and the Soviet Union is somehow pathological or somehow a deformed representative of what we take to be normal science, which is Western science.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a question that's always nagged at me when I've been doing my research, and I kind of fell into a fringe science thing. But that's actually not 100% accurate, because when I was in 7th and 8th grade, I would go to the public library and look for things to read, and often I would come across books about UFOs and Bigfoot and things like that, unsolved mysteries, and I found that stuff fascinating. So I read an enormous quantity of extremely bad literature about this kind of thing, and it just kind of never went away. The question of why is some of that stuff legitimate and why is some of that stuff illegitimate is one of the central questions of the history of science, and it's one of the things that dragged me into the field.
Great. So this term pseudoscience seems to at first belong to a family of related terms like pathological science, subpar science, bad science, speculative science. So I was just wondering how it resembles these related terms, and similarly, how does it differ from these related terms?
It's a great question. There's sort of two different families I want to distinguish. One is the one that you've set up. There's a sort of continuum we have in our heads of, say, excellent science, good science, really solid, mediocre science, which is definitely what most people do. That's just the nature of the world. Then there's poor science, substandard science, and there's really bad science. I don't think pseudoscience is kind of on that continuum, because there are many kinds of bad science, or science that's considered substandard or poor, or etc., which isn't labeled pseudoscience. Pseudoscience is a sort of different kind of label. So I think it belongs in a different category, a category that pathological science also belongs in. The family of concepts here are ones I like to think of as like heresy. No one has ever thought they were a heretic. No one says, I have an extremely heterodox religious belief that's wrong and schismatic. They all think they have the truth. And pseudoscience, people who are accused of being pseudoscientists likewise think that they're just regular scientists, but somehow disagree with the mainstream. Likewise, no one thinks they're pathological either. That means these are concepts that are attributed to a certain set of people by their opponents, usually by mainstream religious people in the case of heresy, or mainstream scientists in the case of pseudoscience. Pathological science is a subset of these kinds of pejorative terms, a subset of pseudoscience, which refers, the concept is really coined in the 30s in reference to parapsychology by Irving Langmuir, who is a physical chemist, won a Nobel Prize for his work on light bulbs, who thinks of pathological science as that science on the boundary where the error bars are pretty close to the phenomena you're interested in looking at. So you can't really tell what's wishful thinking and what's actually the affecting question. And pathological science is a term used to lump together a set of things. Cold fusion is sometimes put in this category, but certainly anything related to parapsychology gets lumped into this zone. I'm not endorsing this view, but I do think there is a folk categorization that you see among scientists of different kinds of pseudoscience. And that's what one can really legitimately be interested in, is why the scientists tag these terms. Sorry, long answer to the question.
Great, no. So there seems to be this difficulty to sort of pin down pseudoscience cleanly, this sort of demarcation problem, the question of boundary work, things like that. So how have people historically gone about trying to define pseudoscience, trying to approach pseudoscience, and how should we think about pseudoscience well and productively?
I'll try to answer all that, or at least give some ways of thinking about it, and do remind me if I don't quite manage. So the various, since pseudoscience is a category created by scientists, the way into understanding pseudoscience is to look at what different scientific communities, because it's a group concept, think science is.
Mm-hmm.
And at different time periods, that means different kinds of things. So with the case of mesmerism, which is really the pseudoscience concept is born at the late 18th, early 19th century. And that's not an accident, because that's around when the notion of professionalized, rigorized science gets built.
Mm-hmm.
So for people like Lavoisier and Benjamin Franklin, the mesmerists are not scientists, and they're not because they don't adhere to certain publication protocols. They're too credulous about the testimony of poor, reliable, drifting people, and other categories like that. And as a result, that gives us a clue as historians of how to think about pseudoscience, because a particular community's understanding of what pseudoscience is gives you a very strong insight into what their notion of science is. And since science is a very protean, as you know, flexible category that changes over time, we can track the reasons why people think something is pseudoscience in each period. So the reason why people think phrenology, measuring the bumps on someone's skull, is a pseudoscience in the early 19th century are not the same reasons why Bigfoot enthusiasts are considered pseudoscientific in the 50s and 60s of the 20th century,
Mm-hmm.
or the reasons why Nazi racial theorists were considered pseudoscientific in the 30s and especially the 40s. And so we can get a really flexible and quite rich marker of what counts as science in each period by looking at how they define those who don't belong.
Mm-hmm. Great, yeah. Sort of a related point, perhaps just elaborating on what you've said, what do we gain as historians when we look at pseudoscience? Why is this sort of a useful category of analysis?
So it's a great question, because one might say, look, there's a limited amount of time in the world. There are so many things that need to be studied. Why are you studying this? This is the detritus, this garbage dump of thinking. And it's a fair point. There is a limited amount of time. There's lots of scientists we know nothing about, lots of scientific theories that need to be more deeply historicized. And I think there's two answers to this. One is to pick who the scientists are, the legitimate science we should study in advance, and say that's the good stuff, and this is the dreck over here, and we're not going to look at it, prejudges a historical question over time. And there are many cases where we don't know what the answer was unknown to the participants. Does oxygen exist, or is burning a phenomenon caused by the phlogiston leaving a burning body?
Mm-hmm.
It's an extremely interesting question. We can say we're not going to read the phlogistonists because they're wrong. But historians of science don't say that, because we can learn a lot and about what people think science is in that period, and also the outcome of the dispute is the thing we're interested in figuring out.
Mm-hmm.
By prejudging it, that would be a mistake. Pseudoscience is just an extreme case of that.
Okay.
It's something that is not just wrong or considered wrong, it's demonized, and therefore it's on a continuum of things that have been added to the purview, the toolkit of historians of science, as a thing they can explore and get a more nuanced picture of science.
Mm-hmm.
Second reason is people get really angry about pseudoscience. Astronomers are upset about UFOs. They don't just dislike the idea, they get angry and mad. That turning up of the volume is something that I personally as a historian love to see.
Mm-hmm.
The controversies are really heated. People say things much more explicitly than they would say in a debate that they think is among peers where certain codes of etiquette and polite interchange apply. And this is just it's a different kind of phenomenon. The way physicians talk about homeopathy is not the same way they talk about now acupuncture. Although there was a time when they talked about acupuncture in roughly the same way they talk about chiropractics and homeopathy today. So it's that turned up volume thing that I think makes this a particularly rich area to explore.
Mm-hmm. One era is mainstream science is another era of pseudoscience. So how can we think about pseudoscience as sort of a category that's dynamic, that moves over time in flexible ways?
I think that's precisely what we should be doing, is instead of lumping together all the things that have been labeled pseudoscience and say, well, these things have all been called pseudoscience, let's figure out what pseudoscience is by studying their properties. That's kind of assuming that they have something in common.
Mm-hmm.
So if you go to a zoo and someone says these are all animals, you can infer something from the fact that, from what they share in common, what an animal is. But pseudoscience isn't labeled with a sense of intentionality, and people label it differently in each period. There's no reason to assume that the properties that phrenology has, the properties that alchemy had, and the properties that, let's see, UFO studies, Lysenkoism in the Soviet Union, eugenics, those things don't all have the same categories. And some of these things, as you mentioned, were once sciences. Eugenics was just how human genetics was discussed. And then it becomes, well, portions of it are labeled pseudoscientific, and the rest of it is called human genetics. And there's a lot of continuity. Likewise, astrology is a mainstream area of natural philosophy in the 16th century and 17th century. And by the end of the 17th century, it gets fringed out. And now it's something that appears in newspapers and enrages astronomers that it's still there.
Mm-hmm.
So we can get a sense of, we can follow a field and look at the process by which it is fringed. That's one way we can see the dynamics of it. Or we can just look at how in certain periods of time, like the Renaissance, some things are considered beyond the pale and some things are considered in, and learn something about that culture's definition of the legitimacy of knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
That's a static picture of a dynamic landscape, or you can take one body of doctrine, like alchemy, which was a form of chemistry, or was just how people investigated matter in the way we call chemistry.
Mm-hmm.
But it had weird components and controversial theories in it. Those controversial theories get the label alchemy, and chemistry gets given to the good stuff
Mm-hmm.
that we now judge later. And we can follow that over time, learn a great deal about the process by which scientific communities form and decide who's in and who's out.
Mm-hmm. So your book, The Pseudoscience Wars, is structured around this case of Velikovsky.
Yes.
And so I was wondering why you picked this particular case. Is it uniquely informative? Why this case over, say, Daniken's Chariot of the Gods, or over, telepathy?
It's a great question. To a certain extent, I didn't pick Velikovsky, he picked me. So I was familiar with the name from this sort of mid-childhood, early adolescence reading I was doing. I saw it, but I didn't really know what he thought. And then I noticed that Princeton had acquired his papers in 2005, and I thought, that's around the corner from my office. I'll just go and take a look and see what they have, maybe write an article. And it was just such a rich trove of document because he kept everything. He kept his fan mail, his hate mail, his publisher correspondence, manuscripts, his marginalia. It's extremely rich, and he would use this archive as a tool to fight people.
Mm-hmm.
So when people demonized him, he would respond by quoting other people's letters or by quoting their own letters back at them. And so that active set of documents was just sitting right here, and since I had an interest in this question of pseudoscience and demarcation, the stuff picked me.
Mm-hmm.
It's like that line in The Lord of the Rings, that the ring wants to be found.
Yeah.
Stuff wants to be used. But why, and there's other benefits this has, aside from the fact that it's cataloged and local and so on. Von Däniken is still alive, and occasionally still publishes. That makes him somewhat trickier to get a handle on, because he's actively managing his legacy himself. And he controls his own papers, and they're not deposited anywhere. So you have access to various sources. There are other topics that are harder to get a handle on, but still quite rich. UFOs is a great example of something to try and get a handle on, but that material is dispersed across a wide number of places. There's classification issues associated with the Air Force. It shares some commonalities with Von Däniken and Velikovsky, in that there are fan sites online, and people will email you and clutter up your inbox with lots of information about this. This happens to me all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But that's harder to put together because it's a more grassroots movement with many different locations, and Velikovsky is centered around a particular person.
Mm-hmm.
And that just made him a very convenient source which to hang, or a very convenient sort of narrative strategy on which to hang a set of questions about different kinds of fringe practices and doctrines.
Mm-hmm. Also, something that came across as I was reading your story of Velikovsky was sort of the stakeholders who were involved in this incident. There are scientists. You also have the public involved. You have publishers. So I was wondering if you could talk about how these stakeholders play into these histories of pseudoscience.
Another great question. One of the things that these varied stakeholders, you don't just see them in this case, in almost every case of a fringe doctrine, you see multiple stakeholders. There are some, like parapsychology, that at the beginning are very closely within the psychological community, but for many of these fields, they're of tremendous interest to a wide number of people, either people who are in the scientific community in some way but work as engineers in industry and feel somewhat marginalized from the mainstream, people who had scientific interests but then moved to other fields, people who are just interested in the nature of the universe and have no basic education. And so the fringe doctrines are appealing to lots of different people. And that means we get a sense, again, since pseudoscience is always a way to look at science, we understand science as not just the province of elites who work in ivory tower to each other. I know historians of science know this. It's not like, there are many areas like Darwinism, we see this in many places, but there's something so much more, I want to say inflammatory, but I mean like kind of effervescent about the interaction on multiple levels. And it's precisely because a lot of these fringe doctrines have extremely commonsensical bases based on ordinary perception or texts people know very well, like the Bible or other documents like that, that enable lots of people to interact with them at multiple levels in a way that string theory just doesn't because of the barrier of entry. So because of that, you get a lot of these stakeholders, and I think that makes these particularly exciting questions.
Yeah, so now to sort of close, I was just wondering if any rich or informative modern examples of pseudoscience where scientists are actively sort of demarcating pseudoscience. Any examples of that come to mind in the present day?
Absolutely. I mean, I could just take a cop-out and say, well, there's creationism and intelligent design, but the place where you most actively see it is in global warming debates, where denial that global warming is happening, even the fact that you call it global warming denialism, it implicitly ties it to Holocaust denialism, which is a way of fringing something out. Likewise, the people who don't think anthropogenic global warming is happening. Many of them think the world is warming, but the humans didn't cause it, or say they think that. Many of them think that the mainstream climate scientists are pseudoscientific as well, and that is an extremely contentious area where you have a set of scientists, many of whom are well-credentialed, but publishing through think tank literature and outside the general peer-reviewed structure, which they claim is biased against them, in favor of a scientific position that would call for less regulation of industries, especially fossil fuel-related industries. You see this with ozone science, acid rain, global warming. There's a large number of these particular cases. So that's the most contentious area that I would see right now. But that's it's a different breed again, which shows you how mutable this category is, of highly politicized, extremely well-funded scientific and fringe scientific endeavors. You have plenty of other parapsychological revivals, theories of UFOs that persist. But I would say if you wanted to pick one sort of salient hot-button zone of this, that would be where I would go.
And then just quickly, what your answer brought to mind something, and that is, what are sort of the tools by which things become fringed? What are some of the methods that people use to fringe certain ideas or certain doctrine?
So partly it depends on what period you are in. So one way you can do that is by establishing credentials. Say you have to have a PhD to talk about this topic, or by and the most common way it's done now, and this is really a post-World War II phenomenon, is the creation of peer-reviewed literatures where you have gatekeepers who say this is either a bad article or this is an article that's not even on topic. It's not part of our community. And that kind of gatekeeping function either happens with credentialing institutions or it happens in journals. There's many other social ways where that might happen, where you have elite institutions that hold the barriers at bay. That's a very common feature that's not just part of fringing out these kind of demonized doctrines. It's a way that orthodoxy gets enforced, period. So when Chomskyan linguistics was beginning to burst forward in the 1950s, that's not allowed in the major linguistics programs, and it gets moved to other schools that aren't classic centers of that because it can't break in. And people create their own journals, and eventually you get your own fields when you do that. And sometimes we see that as a healthy process, and sometimes we see that as a pathological process where you have another kind of parallel structure going on. I would say is that as historians of science, as a community, we should think about those processes as related to each other as fundamentally interesting, as very similar processes structurally, and then maybe we can learn something about the process of discipline formation by looking at the process of fringing, because they seem to have the same tools as you just noted.
Great. Well, thank you so much for spending the time to speak with us.
Thank you so much for the conversation. It was very interesting.